Your lecturer is Professor Hannah B. Harvey. Dr. Harvey is a nationally known professional storyteller and holds a PhD in communication studies with a concentration in performance studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Harvey is an award-winning director and performer and has delivered workshops in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Morocco. Her energetic style brings to life humorous and compelling stories from the worlds of personal experience, oral history, folklore, and myth. Dr. Harvey was selected by students at Kennesaw State University for the Alumni Association Commendation for Teaching Impact.
I tell stories. I first came into storytelling from my grandfather. He would tell me stories about our family history with that wood fire crackling at my back. So at an early age, I was aware of storytelling as the everyday rhythm of our home and as a public art form. Most of our lives are spent telling stories. Storytelling is core to the human experience. Your stories are what ground you, what gives you a sense of purpose and identity and continuity between the past and the present. Story is so much of your life. Oral storytelling is the primary way that you remember and record the peak moments in the life of your family. And as it is so core to the human experience, we're going to examine how you can tell your stories better. And by that, I mean tell your stories in such a way that it brings them to life for other people, both within and without your own family, or your place of business, or your own community or neighborhood. I'd like to get started by telling you something that's just a story in my family. I'd like for you to look down at your hands right now. Just take a look at them. How are they feeling? Have you been typing too much today, or maybe working outside with them? One of the things that I remember most about my grandfather was his hands. You see, my grandfather, he learned carpentry from his father. And by the time that I knew him, those hands, they were just gnarled. And those knuckles, they looked like just big marbles had been stuck inside, underneath the skin. Inside those knuckles, they were so large. He used to come home from work when I'd come to visit them. He'd come in of an evening and he'd take that big hand and he'd just pat me down on the head with it. And when I was younger, I didn't think about where those hands had been to make them so leathery and so big. When he was a little boy, my grandfather, he would follow his father out to his workshop. He said, I was just tagging along behind, wondering what he was going to do. And he would follow him out to his workshop. And my grandfather said he'd watch as that great-grandfather, he would take these poplar boards, good wood. Poplar is good lumber. And he'd take that board and he'd set it down on his workbench. And he would take out a plane and he would start planing that poplar wood. And those shavings, they would just curl up off of that piece of wood. And my grandfather just sitting there on the ground, he would watch as those shavings curled up and fell onto the floor in front of him. And he could smell that wood. It smelled so good. He'd take those curled up pieces and he would just stretch them out. He said they'd be long, 24 inches or longer. And he'd stretch those shavings out, and he watched his father. And as he watched, he learned. And my grandfather, he took those young hands when he came of age and he started planing the boards himself. And when the war broke out, he took those hands to Guam, and he put those hands inside the engines of bomber planes. And when the war was over, he came home and he took those hands and he wrapped them around his bride when he came home alive from the war. Those strong hands that shook his father's hand and the hand of preachers and young couples in our town, because he built houses and he built churches with his father. And he always said, now we don't build homes, we build houses. You can't build a home, you have to make a home. It takes a heap of living in a house to make it home. Those hands that he washed and washed so that he could hold his baby girl, that tiny head just nestled in the cup of his palm. Those hands he washed again as he held his second girl, that head just nestled into those fingers. Hands that held the rod and the reel and the fish and the fork and the belly. Hands that planed like his daddy had. Hands that held a walking stick as he continued to exercise after triple bypass surgery. Hands that held the walker, held the bed frame, held the tiny foot of his great-grandson. That tiny foot, it was just dwarfed in that big hand, but that skin, it was smooth now. A hand that held mine, like he'd done all my life, like he still does, even though those hands are far away now. You can tell a lot about a person just by looking at their hands. Now that's a story about my family, and it's about something so small and everyday, a person's hands. But, and this is key, that story takes us to something larger. It even taps into universal themes about aging and love and questions such as, what does it mean to make a home? What happens to us when we die? In the Academy, you'll find storytelling studies across a wide variety of programs because storytelling directly taps into so many different fields, communications and theater and performance studies, education. And because of my background, I approach the classroom as a scholar artist, which means I do storytelling and I coach storytelling in a very practical way. And as a scholar, I'm interested in understanding the very nature of story and storytelling. And my students and I have found that by analyzing how storytelling works, how we use stories in everyday life, and why we tell stories, by asking these how and why questions about those stories that have staying power, we become better practitioners of storytelling as an art form. Now, I'm a professional, but often I'm telling stories to my friends and neighbors and on the sofa with my little son. My goal is to show you how professional storytelling techniques can help you in telling your own stories day to day. So at this point, I guess somebody would ask us to define our terms. What's a story? What's a storyteller? Someone once posed a challenge to Ernest Hemingway. His friends bet that he couldn't write a story in 6 words. Here's what he wrote. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. So a story can be very small, about a person's hands or 6 words. Or there's an epic history of a nation, a big story. Now let's take a second to distinguish between written narrative, Hemingway stories, or narrative that we find in print, from oral narrative, stories that live in conversation, that live outside of writing, stories about your childhood, stories about when you were starting your company. These oral narratives are stories that you know, and they're often not written down. They live in here, in your memory, and they come alive through here, through your voice and your body as you tell those stories. You are a storyteller. We are all storytellers in our daily lives. But these questions, what's a story, what's a storyteller, that's not really the interesting question. The question is, what do stories do for us? Well, stories do a lot of things for us. Orally told stories can delineate relationships and set parameters. Whenever we have a family gathering for Thanksgiving or any holiday, someone in my family always has to make the pink salad. And I can't tell you the ingredients for the pink salad because you're not in my family. And if you ever saw this salad, you would probably wonder who would want to know what's in that. But it's special to us. It's even sacred to the cooks in our family because that recipe is a story that we only share inside our family. That story delineates borders between our family and the outside world, the people who know that recipe and the people who don't. And it's a small thing. It's a story about a salad, but that story does something very big for us. It separates us and defines us as a cohesive unit. Stories make life coherent. They give us a sense of who we are and where we've come from, and they give us a picture of a future that we can work towards, or of a future that we don't want. The stories that you tell your children about the mistakes that you've made, so that they don't make the same ones that you did, and you hope that they listen to you. That story about my grandfather, it gives a sense of history and trajectory for his life. And it makes death bearable. Because in that story, that's not the end of him. He's still holding my hand. You may have folks in your life who still hold your hand, too. In that story, it's not the end of his story when he dies. When you're telling someone a story, you're doing much more than just relaying a message to someone. The story is a container for our deepest longings and hopes and fears. Stories don't just impart life, they question life. Storytelling forces self-reflection. It puts a mirror up to yourself and up to culture. The story gives you access to yourself. It's how you get a handle on yourself. If you don't recognize your story, you can't change your story. That's therapy. What psychotherapy does is it helps someone shape a narrative for a listener. And in hearing yourself tell your own story and having someone else question that story for the missing parts or the forgotten parts, you can listen to that story and you can make change. Stories reveal human truths, and truth is a different thing from fact. Facts are what happened. Truths are about what those happenings meant to people. You may have a story that isn't factual. It could be a completely made-up story about a man made of gingerbread who runs away from home and gets eaten by a fox. And that may never have happened. But it gives you a way to see the truth of how foolish it is to run away from the wisdom of people who love you just for the sake of having it your own way, because you could wind up in the middle of a river in the jaws of a fox. Stories give us deep truths. And these stories act on us, often invisibly. Many of the ideas that we have about what is really important in life, they come from stories like these. And those are the ideas and values that motivate real material decisions for my life, and maybe yours too. And they come from stories. Now that story, it doesn't live on the page. It lives in the spoken word. And now it lives in the images that you have in your head. Now that's the primary work of oral storytelling, getting the images in my head into your head. Storytelling is focused on image and storyline, not the memorization of written lines. And in this course, as I teach you about telling your stories, we'll learn that this art isn't about memorizing. That's the challenge of live theater, but not storytelling. This art is about getting to know a series of images and knowing them so well that they live in you, that you know them by heart, and you can call them back up, not with the same words every time. And you know this. You know this. Think about it. The stories about your mornings as a young child with your mother, or going to games with your father in your hometown where you grew up, they're not written down, most likely. But you don't need them written down. You can tell them by heart. You can call them up because you know them. I want this course to be useful in every aspect of your personal and professional life. So throughout these lectures, I'll coach you as you try out professional storytelling techniques to shape your stories. Now, some of these are writing techniques, and others are up-on-your-feet exercises to get you ready to tell. And these practical bits of advice and exercises, they will prepare you to tell in a variety of situations, and they'll prepare you for when things don't go according to plan. For example, there was one time when I was performing at a festival, and I was wearing these pants with an elastic waist, very comfortable, very forgiving, but very stretchy. And I move around a lot when I'm telling stories, and I was telling this story, and a little girl was running, and I ran, and the microphone pack that was hooked onto my elastic waistband, it came flying off into the audience, and the earpiece, which you can see this earpiece on me right now, that earpiece went flying off with it into the front row. And there I was, with about 500 people waiting for my next words. And so I walked over to the stationary microphone and grabbed it and came right back, and I went right on running. Now, maybe you're thinking, but I don't have any stories. I've lived an ordinary life. Nothing's ever happened to me. But as you hear stories being told, as I tell you stories, and as you hear stories from some of my storytelling colleagues, I'll be willing to bet that you'll come up with plenty of ideas. And I'll be giving you prompts. I'll talk about the kind of storytelling journal that most storytellers keep and use to develop prompts into stories that can be told. We'll start the course by looking at the basics of the storytelling process. It's important to understand that storytelling is a living collaboration. It involves you and your audience and the story. The stories you tell are constantly adapting to each different audience that you encounter. They aren't delivered in a fixed, intact form. We'll examine stories that have staying power. We'll look at the classic stories, from family stories to traditional fairy tales and myths. And as you'll see, fairy tales were never just for children. Why have certain stories lasted so long, even across cultures? We'll practice, using lots of how-to workshops that will help you really develop your stories and make them more engaging to audiences and even more enjoyable for you to tell. And that's where this course may surprise you. How exactly do we workshop to improve our storytelling? Well, it has to do with the very nature of orality. It's very different from written communication or the dramatic interpretation of the written word. Now let's revisit that hands story for a moment. I want to bring out some of the qualities of oral storytelling in this story. Now, we already said storytelling is ephemeral. Oral storytelling is also economical. And by that I mean it's not wasteful. There are many things that I could have said in that story, but I trimmed the story down to focus on a few specific things. We'll discuss what to leave in and what to leave out of your stories. And you'll find that some stories are told long for one audience and short for another. The story is additive. The story builds on itself. And this happened, and then he planed, and then he went to Guam, and then he built houses, and this, and this, and this. The story also contains oral memory aids. For example, that repeated image of hands, it's a unifying image, but it's also a memory trick for the storyteller. If I'm lost in that story, I just go back to the hands. And when you go back to some of the earliest stories that we have on record, stories that come out of an oral culture, you'll see the same kind of redundancy, repeated modifiers for Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, or Enkidu, the faithful companion, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These repeated phrases are memory aids. They highlight the fact that somebody had to remember all those stories. And like an epic, the hands story is action-centered. We move from planing to working on engines to building houses. Storytelling is focused on action, on agon or struggle, drama. And those actions happened in a specific context, not some abstract idea of going to war. No, Granddaddy worked on a plane in Guam. And that story that's ephemeral and economical and embodied and full of repetition and additive and action-centered, this story keeps my grandfather alive. Storytelling is central to the survival of the family and of specific people. Most people in the world don't exist. My grandfather is gone, and there is nothing except for 2 kids and 3 grandkids and the stories that we share. Most people, there's nothing left of them. That's appalling to realize. Someone so big in your life just passes on. Now, my son never got to meet his great-grandfather. And another wonderful person he will never meet is his great-great-aunt May. She died long before he was born, but he will know her through this story. I wanted to share a story with you all that it's a story that we tell in my family, and it's one that I tell to my other family members. And it has to do with the card game Old Maid. Did any of you all ever play this card game? Okay, some nods. Yes, okay. So, and you had that special deck of cards. You've seen that. Okay, so on my special deck of cards, and I'm small, right? I wear heels. So, or I think I'm small. But when I was even smaller, when I was 7 years old, we had the deck of cards just felt so huge to me. There were these big cards, and they had these very colorful looking people on them, except for one very special card. And which card was that? The Old Maid. And on my deck of cards, this woman, she was kind of grandmotherly looking, even though she was the old maid. She had on this kind of little dress. She was in a rocking chair, and she had this gray hair that was kind of pinned up into a bun, and she had two knitting needles, wooden knitting needles that were just pronged in the top of it, and she had this little smile on her face. You never wanted to get the Old Maid. Now, my great Aunt May, she was nothing like the woman on that card. Aunt May, she wore pants. Only she wore those polyester pants, the kind of scratchy ones, you know. And if you saw her in the summertime, if you looked into her house, you'd see this tall, big-boned woman. She was skinny, but she was tall. And she wore those polyester pants in the summertime. And if you happened to pass by her house and look in the window, you'd see her in a pair of those pants and her hair up in curlers and nothing on but her bra. She walked around the house that way. She didn't care. I loved Aunt May. Now that was in the summertime. In the wintertime, she'd put on a sweater, and she'd put on one of those pairs of polyester pants, and then she'd put another pair on right over on top of it because it got cold in her house. It was an old house. It was from the 1930s. It was the house that she had grown up in. And it had 2 stories, and it had one of those wonderful tin roofs that sounded so good in the rain. And it got cold in that house in the winter, and so Aunt May, you may have seen this, she took a sheet and she would drape it over the staircase to trap the heat downstairs. And she lived in that house. And when I was little, when I was 7 and 8 years old, and whenever I would get sick and have to stay home from school, well, my mom, she worked, so she would take me over to Aunt May's house, and Aunt May would take care of me. And we always had to call before we came. Because if you didn't call before you came and you walked up to her door and you knocked on the door, she would answer it, but this tall, big-boned woman, she would answer the door and she would have a hatchet raised in her hand. And this tall woman, and once she saw who you were, oh, well, then she'd set down that hatchet. Well, come on in. And I loved Aunt May. And so after she knew who we were, and she'd set down that hatchet. It was as tall as I was, set it right by the door, and we'd walk inside. We'd pass by her kitchen, and this is where she kept her spit cup. I don't know if you people know what a spit cup is. Aunt May would take these margarine tubs, parquet tubs, and she would rinse them out, and she would keep it in the windowsill. And so whenever Aunt May had spit in the day, she would walk into that kitchen, she'd take down that tub, and she'd spit into it, and then she'd rinse it out and set it back up. So I'd walk in, and I'd pass by that hatchet, past the kitchen and the spit cup, and we'd walk inside. And if I was sick, she would sit me down on her couch. It was that scratchy wool couch that was orange and brown, and she'd make me a bed there, and I'd pull the sheet up, and she would turn on the TV. It had one of those pull dials and one of those turns for channels 1 through 12. And we could chart our day by the turn of that dial. Channel 5. Days of Our Lives. And Aunt May, during Days of Our Lives, she would teach me her exercises. This was a 70-year-old woman, and she would lay down on her back on the floor, and she would kick her legs up, and she would just start spinning those legs up in the air like a bicycle, and I'd do that with her, and I taught her my exercises. This 70-year-old woman, I had her get down on all fours, and I would climb up on top of her back, and I would ride her like a horse all the way around that living room. I loved Aunt May. Channel 11, the news. And it was lunchtime. And Aunt May, she would go into that kitchen where the spit cup was, and she would make me a can of chicken noodle soup, Campbell's chicken noodle soup. Only she made it the way that Aunt May made it. And she made it with a little bit of milk and a little bit of pepper. And you got that face. Yeah, that's what I did the first time I tried it, too. I looked at this creamy stuff, and I looked up at her. I said, Mama, Aunt May, that's not how Mama makes it. And she said, well, just try it. Now, if you don't like it, I'll make you something else. And so I took that first little hesitant sip. Took another one. And from that day until this, that's how I make my chicken noodle soup. It is so, go home and try it. It's so good. I loved Aunt May's. Channel 12, Donahue. And when Donahue was on, it was the afternoon, and Aunt May, she would get on the phone, and she would call women on her calling circle. Now, Aunt May never seemed to leave the house, but she always knew everything that was going on in our community from the women on her calling circle. And she would be talking on the phone, and Donahue was on, and that was when I would play with Aunt May's buttons. She had this collection of buttons, the ones that had popped off of those polyester pants and the extra ones that came with it. She collected them all in an old powder box, powder for your face. And I'd dump those buttons out, and I'd play with them on the floor, and there were big, shiny buttons with rhinestones on them, and little tiny faux pearls, and little pink buttons, and big, shiny cream buttons, fabric-covered buttons. I'd play with those buttons, and I would imagine what was behind that sheet behind me that covered up that second floor, covered up that staircase, and I'd wonder. And it was years later before I found out what was on that second floor of that house. I grew up. I'd been 7 and 8 then. I grew up. I got older, went off to college, and Aunt May, she got older. And it was only after I got older and gained some perspective that I realized that Aunt May was very nice to me, but to the rest of the family, she was the orneriest, most cantankerous, crotchety, mean old woman. She was the old maid. She'd never married. And she was kind of shy and socially awkward with a lot of adults, and she was tall and skinny. She played basketball when she was younger, but she never really knew how to interact with other people. She still lived in that house that she had grown up in, her parents' house. And when Aunt May got older and she had to be put in a nursing home, we couldn't care for her or give her the care that she needed. She went to a nursing home. I came home from college for a visit, and the whole family, we came into that house, and we took down that sheet, and we walked upstairs, and I finally saw what was in that second floor. Beautiful antiques. Furniture and carved headboards, beautifully, intricately carved wood and tea sets, and all of these antiques. Aunt May, like many of the women in her generation, she was never financially independent. She was the custodian of many family heirlooms, but she never had any money of her own. She was the old maid. But Aunt May, when I was little, she let me ride on her back like a horse. Aunt May, she wasn't that woman on the card. Aunt May was beautiful. The last time I saw my Aunt May, we went to the nursing home. I'd come home from college. I went with my mom, and we walked in the door, and you know how it is kind of in some nursing homes. You open that door, and it smells faintly of rubbing alcohol and urine. We walked in, and we were going down the hall to her room, and as I passed by this man in a wheelchair, he reached out and grabbed my shirt, and I kind of shied away from him, and I told my mom, and she said, well, some people just don't get a lot of visitors in here, and I bet he was just lonely. And I was really glad that we were going to see my Aunt May. And we walked in the door, and Days of Our Lives was on. And she was on the phone with one of the women in her calling circle, and she was finishing up that conversation, so we visited with her for about an hour. And when it came time to leave, I bent down and I hugged her, and I stood back up, I held her hand. And I remembered all those times when I'd walked into her house, and she held my hand, big, tall, and strong, big boned. Now I was the tall one. She looked up at me, and she said very firmly, "Don't forget about me." And I thought at the time that she just wanted me to come back and visit, but she passed away soon after that. Don't forget about me. I keep a jar of Aunt May's buttons on my desk, right beside a picture of her. She's got that big smile, all wrinkles. Don't forget about me. She's one of the most beautiful women I have ever known. At a certain point in life, you know you have a book in you. Will you do it? Well, you may not have time to write it, but you can call a child over and tell them. Just sit your kid down. Tell them a story. I'm so glad that you've joined me for this course. Now let's get started. Every time I tell Aunt May's story, it's slightly different. And that's because of how storytelling works within something called the storytelling triangle. And we'll begin to talk about this storytelling triangle in the next lecture. See you then.